Hello everyone, this is Dr. Young, and in this video we're just going to give an overview of cellular respiration. Talk about the 4 steps, talk about where they occur in the cell, and just introduce you again, or just remind you about what a metabolic process is. Right, so if you take a look at our cellular respiration equation, you've probably seen this a couple times before, right? Usually people represent it with some formula that represents a carbohydrate, and usually people call it glucose. It doesn't have to be glucose. We're just talking about carbohydrates in general, right? So your C6H12O6. O2, right? We know that we need O2 to survive. This is the air we breathe, right? So this is in the air we breathe. Right, glucose, right? This would be in the food that we're eating. Oxygen in the air we breathe. And then the idea is that the CO2, right, we know that we produce CO2. We breathe out CO2 and we excrete it through the renal system. So breathe out and also excrete as like bicarbonate and stuff. And then water, same thing, right? We breathe out water and we also excrete water. So we breathe out and excrete it, which is a nice way of saying to go to the bathroom, right? And normally people don't think about breathing out water, right? Unless you remember, like, you know, you breathe on a cold mirror or a cold window in the winter and you see it steam up, right? It's because we breathe out a lot of our water. And so this whole equation looks pretty fine, right? It's a pretty straightforward equation. I've got it nicely balanced. I've got everything here. But cellular respiration is a lot more complicated than just these two things turn into these two things, right? Like it's just some one magical process. Boom, we create energy, right? This would be plus energy, which is how living things live. And then we just create energy and we can harvest that. It's much, much more complicated. And so we need to talk about the metabolic processes, right? So here's the idea of a metabolic process is just, it's a series of reactions that get you from one type of compound to another type of compound. So it's not just that, right, glucose turns into carbon dioxide and water. It's that first glucose gets turned into some intermediate compound, right? Like glucose 6-phosphate or fructose 6-phosphate or 1,6-phosphate or pyruvate or all these different intermediates, right? The idea is that it gets turned into something, that something gets turned into another thing, that gets turned into another thing, that gets turned to another thing, and you have a whole bunch of small steps to elicit this larger change in the compound and the change in energy. And of course, with each of these steps, right, most all of your metabolic processes, most all of the steps involve some kind of enzyme, right, to help catalyze that reaction. And it's kind of how we control that pathway. Are we going to turn that pathway on or off, as we can upregulate or downregulate either the expression of the enzyme, or we can like inhibit it or something like that with some inhibitor. And since enzymes are so specific, right, every single reaction is going to have a different enzyme. So the enzyme that catalyzes the first reaction is probably not the enzyme that catalyzes the second one, and is not the one that catalyzes the third or the fourth or the fifth, right? So this is why DNA is so big and complicated. We have so many proteins and so many enzymes that we need to code for, so that we can catalyze and help speed up all of these different reactions along a metabolic chain, right? So the idea is that a metabolic process is all of this stuff, right? All of this in between, right? This would be your metabolic pathway. So metabolic pathway. And let me show you the Sigma Aldrich metabolic pathway poster. It's pretty crazy. So what we've got here is a file that I posted on your website. This is the Sigma Aldrich's metabolic pathways poster. And if you take a look at this, you can see, right, that it's really complicated. There's all these arrows flying around, whole bunch of structures, right? We can zoom in on some so we get a better sense of what these are, right? You can recognize things like glucose, and we'll talk about glucose 6-phosphate, fructose, all down here in the middle, right? All of this area, all of this stuff. But it's just, I just wanted you to get a sense of how complicated cells can be, right, in these metabolic processes. It's not like just one thing instantly turns into a really different complicated molecule, right? It's a step by step by step by step process. There's lots of different enzymes, lots of different intermediates if you want to turn one thing into another. So like, for example, right, we're talking about taking glucose and turning it into more ATP and carbon dioxide and water. So glucose, right, is following this whole pathway down here, all the way down, all the way down. We keep on looking down. To make pyruvate, it moves into the mitochondria. That's what this little green thing is. Turns into acetyl-CoA, goes into the citric acid cycle, does all of these reactions here in this circle. This is the electron transport chain. It goes into an ATP synthase. until it finally gets turned into ATP, right? And so that's a lot of different steps. I don't expect you to memorize all of these or anything like that. I just want you to have a sense that these metabolic processes are very complicated. There's lots of intermediates. In this poster, right, this is not, I mean, as you can see, this is an overwhelming poster. This is just enzymes that Sigma alter response to cell U. This is not anywhere near all of the reactions that are actually going on in a cell at any given time. So things are really complicated. We're going to focus in on respiration, which is just the idea of turning glucose into carbon dioxide and water. Right, so that's really, really complicated. There's a lot of things going on in that poster, a lot of metabolic processes. We're going to take cellular respiration and break it down into 4 steps. Sometimes people break it up into 3 steps. I like to break it up into 4 steps. Our book does also. Where the first step, right, is just glycolysis, and that's where we're going to turn glucose into pyruvate. And that'll all occur in the cytosol, or the cytosol. We'll talk about that in a second. Second step is taking that pyruvate and turning it into acetyl-CoA. I call it the formation of acetyl-CoA. Sometimes people call that the formation step or the intermediate step. Third step is the citric acid cycle. This one has a bunch of different names. Chemists tend to generally call it the citric acid cycle because citric acid and citrates are the intermediates in that cycle, or the tricarboxylic acid cycle, abbreviated the TCA cycle. Again, because there's a lot of carboxylic acids. Biologists tend to call it the Krebs cycle, after one of the people who's responsible for figuring out a lot of what's going on there. They're all the same thing. It's all the same step. And the citric acid cycle is where you take that acetyl-CoA and turn it into carbon dioxide and ATP, and then those reduced coenzymes. And then the last step is oxidative phosphorylation, where you take those reduced coenzymes and oxygen, use the energy that's produced from that to recreate your ATP and recreate your oxidized coenzymes. And these don't all occur in the same part of the cell. There's a little bit of differences. So let me show you where these things occur. Right, the idea here is that your glucose is going to be right in your bloodstream. So I'll just write glucose, so GLU for glucose. Right, it's going to get transported in through some transmembrane protein. You guys will learn about like GLUT1 and GLUT-S and all that sort of stuff. But the idea is that as soon as it enters the cytoplasm, the cytosol cytoplasm, that's when it undergoes glycolysis. So glycolysis occurs in the as soon as it passes the cell membrane, but before it gets to the mitochondria. The product of glycolysis, we'll talk more about this later, is pyruvate. So that gets turned into pyruvate, or pyruvic acid, pyruvate. And then that pyruvate enters what's called the mitochondria, a mitochondrion, which is what all these little like red dots are supposed to be, right? All these little red dots are the mitochondria. And the mitochondria is this sucker. And so you'll learn again in like your cell bio class a lot more about the mitochondria, but that's where everything else occurs, right? So your pyruvate, that's a U and a V, so U and a V, pyruvate. The pyruvate enters the mitochondria to do all of the rest of the stuff, to get turned into acetyl-CoA and then go through the citric acid cycle and oxidative phosphorylation and all that sort of stuff. So really just one step occurs in the cytoplasm. The rest of it occurs in the actual mitochondria, in that organelle inside of the cell. Let's write that down, right? So where in the cell does glycolysis occur? It happens in the cytoplasm. Whoops. Let me erase that. It occurs in the cytoplasm. The formation of acetyl-CoA. So the pyruvate, like I was just saying on that previous slide, the pyruvate moves into the mitochondria. So that happens in the mitochondria. So the mitochondria, to get turned into acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA goes into the citric acid cycle, also in the mitochondria. And lastly, so does the last step. Last step also occurs in the mitochondria. And then I also want you to know whether or not these things are aerobic processes or anaerobic. And by aerobic, right, we mean requires, right, that it requires molecular oxygen, that it requires O2, right, that it requires this O2 that we're talking about in the overall reaction, that you have to have it in that step. And so glycolysis technically is anaerobic. It does not require O2 in order to function, and that's because of the lactic acid pathway that can or cannot be that can be turned on. So technically, glycolysis does not require oxygen, even though often we do, and I'll talk more about that later. So anaerobic. You do not require it. You do not require oxygen. You can do the lactic acid pathway. Whereas all three of these other steps, they all do directly rely or indirectly rely on O2. So these are all aerobic. They all require O2. And again, we'll talk more about each of these steps in a little bit more detail and talk about how they require O2, right? You can see down here in oxidative phosphorylation, you flat out require O2, so it's clearly there. And these other two steps talk about how it's sort of indirectly requires O2. So that's kind of the overview. I just want you to know, just generally speaking, right? First step is glycolysis. Second step is formation of acetyl-CoA. Third step is citric acid cycle. Fourth step is oxidative phosphorylation. Here's where they occur in the cell. The first one's anaerobic. The last three are aerobic. That's all I want you to know. So take some good notes. Watch our next video on glycolysis. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty details of how we turn glucose into pyruvate and what coenzymes and what types of enzymes are required for those. Happy studying.